Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. At the end of the 19th century, the number of people who wanted Ireland to be an independent state were in a minority, but in just over 2 decades it was, proving that perhaps nothing is inevitable when it comes to forging nation states. This evening, we want to trace how Irish politics and identity have changed throughout more than a century, from Joyce to Heaney, and from the Easter Rising to Brexit. And looking ahead to our summer tour, we consider the possibilities of a new or a united Ireland. Our guest is Daniel Mulhall, former Irish ambassador to the United States and the United Kingdom, and the author of several histories that look at this very topic. Hello and welcome, Daniel.
It's good to talk to you and to talk to our guests from around the world.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want you to start by saying a bit about yourself. I'm trying to understand how you managed to be a diplomat, an ambassador to some key places, and also produce these books at the same time. How do you do it?
Well, I have a good engine. I've never been short of energy, both physical and intellectual. So I have 44 years experience in the Irish Foreign Service. Since leaving the Foreign Service in 2022, I have taught at New York University. I've been a fellow at Magdalen College in Cambridge, and most recently I was a resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University. I've also published a couple of books recently, one in 2022 called Ulysses, A Reader's Odyssey, which was written for the centenary of James Joyce's Ulysses, published in February 1922. So my book came out for the centenary of that publication. And then last year, in December of last year, I published a book called Pilgrim Soul, W.B. Yeats and the Ireland of his time, looking at Yeats's role in the evolution of Irish politics and his influence on Irish history during his very crowded lifetime, when the country underwent a huge political transformation from being a relative, maybe a slightly discontented part of the United Kingdom at the time of Yeats's birth, to being an independent state, effectively a republic, by the time Yeats died in 1939. So I've also published a book on turn of the century Ireland called A New Day Dawning, a portrait of Ireland in 1900. That was my Millennium project. I published that in 1999 to mark the millennium. And then in 2016, I edited a collection of essays called The Shaping of Modern Ireland, again focused on that period between 1890 and 1922, when everything changed in Ireland. As W.B. Yeats put it, all's changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born.
I feel ashamed to be so reductive, but because we're dealing with a huge sweep of history, subjects that I know we could spend the whole hour discussing, Joyce or Yeats, we are going to spend merely a few minutes. So it's very unfair on you, and certainly unfair on them too. But let's go back to that last quarter of the 19th century, right, and ideas about Irish nationalism, the idea of an independent state. And in dealing with those two key literary heroes, Joyce, right, and Yeats, what were their different visions at the time?
Okay, so in 19th century Ireland, there were two political strands. They were competing at times they overlapped. Those two strands were the reformist strand, in other words, those members of the Irish Parliamentary Party who served in the Westminster Parliament from the 1830s until 1918, when the Sinn Féin party won a huge victory in the election that year. And from then on, Irish parliamentarians did not serve at Westminster. They went on to serve in independent Irish Parliament. And the second strand then was the revolutionary strand, which was very unsuccessful, I have to say. There were rebellions in 1803, in 1848, and 1867. And to say they were failures is to give them maybe too much credit. They were abysmal failures. But they kept alive this notion of an independent Ireland coming about. So if we turn the clock forward to, say, 1880, Joyce was born 2 years later. That time, Yeats was 15 years of age, so a young man just finishing his school years and on the threshold of adulthood. At that time, you'd have to say that if you were a a betting man, you'd put a wager down maybe that at some point in the following quarter century, Ireland would get some form of home rule or a devolved government of the kind of government that now exists in Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland. Indeed, not dissimilar to, say, the role of the states in the United States or the role of the states in Australia. Because I know
Canada and Australia had gone their own way. South Africa was about to do the same thing.
Still within the United Kingdom, but having some element of self-government, right? So, if you think about, let's talk about the two writers you mentioned. W.B. Yeats, born into a Protestant family, a middle-class Protestant family. His father's family were mainly clergymen, Church of Ireland clergymen. His mother's family were business people in the west of Ireland. So he was, in his own life and his own heritage, he brought together the two important strands of Anglo-Irish life, the church and the business community. Those are areas where the Anglo-Irish community, the Protestant, British-oriented community in Ireland were strongest were strong in those two sectors, right? Also in the professions. So you wouldn't expect, with Yeats's background, you wouldn't expect him to be an Irish nationalist. You would expect him to be something quite different, right? Maybe to have joined the Orange Order and have become a bastion of the unionist community in Ireland that didn't want to see self-government for Ireland, wanted to see Ireland remaining an integral part of the union rather than a self-governed part of the union. But Yeats, in the 1880s, became immersed himself in the Gaelic literature of the ancient Irish past. He read this literature, of course, in translation. And he became gradually a rather strong Irish nationalist, looking for an independent Ireland, but mainly being interested in the idea of Ireland having a separate culture, drawing on what he saw as the great glories of the Gaelic past that had been suppressed for centuries, that culture could make a comeback in the late 19th century and could be a kind of an antidote to the materialism of the late Victorian era. So he became a strong cultural nationalist and then became drawn into advanced nationalism, maybe even at one stage being sworn in as a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was the secret society that ultimately organized the Easter Rising of 1916. James Joyce, quite different. Born in 1882, so it means that Joyce is exactly the same age as the leaders of the Easter Rising, Patrick Pearse, Thomas MacDonagh, and so forth. Eamon de Valera, who became the leading figure in 20th century Irish politics, was born the same year as James Joyce. And Joyce's father was a fervent supporter of the greatest Irish politician of the late 19th century, Charles Stewart Parnell. And so through his father, Joyce became an enthusiast for Parnell as well. In the 1880s, it looked as if Parnell was going to be able to deliver home rule for Ireland. He convinced Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, to support home rule, and Gladstone's party split, and the Home Rule Bill failed in its first attempt to go through Parliament in 1886. Eventually, in 1893, the bill passed and was then blocked by the House of Lords, and then that was the stalemate that lasted until 2014, when the Home Rule Bill was finally passed. Parnell died in 1891, having fallen from grace because of his involvement in a scandal. He was named in a divorce scandal, in a divorce case, and it was revealed that he'd had a long-term relationship with a married woman, Mrs. Catherine O'Shea. So Joyce left Ireland in 1904 and essentially never returned. Yeats remained in Ireland, or moved back and forth between Britain and Ireland, and from 1917 onwards, he mainly lived in Ireland for the last 22 years of his life. Joyce's attitude to Ireland was that Ireland needed to become more European if it was to become a new and dynamic country. So Joyce was a believer in Ireland being part of the European traditions of culture and literature and so forth. And he left Ireland and essentially never returned. But he only wrote about the Ireland he left behind in 1904. He never wrote anything, hardly, about the life he lived in continental Europe for the 37 years between the year he left Ireland in 1904 and the year of his death in 1941. So Joyce, now, of course, a lot of Irish people are attracted to Joyce because he appears to somehow capture that essence of Irish identity in his deep and penetrating exploration of the Dublin of 1904. But he hardly took any interest in the Ireland that evolved after Joyce left. So, for example, I struggled when I was writing my book on Joyce to find any significant comment from Joyce about the Easter Rising or the War of Independence that followed it. So he was someone who distanced himself from Ireland, but was fascinated by the country he left behind, but not that concerned about the country's evolution after he left it in 1904.
Okay. I want to bank these stories, and I want to come back to them a bit later.
Sure.
My superficial understanding is that these ideas about Ireland, if you look at the political development from the First World War onwards, almost kicks to the sideways, or in a way that they're literary, but almost, I will come back to this idea in a second, but it seemed to me that Ireland becomes nationalist and Catholic after the First World War, and you don't get around to ideas of a sort of European Ireland until much, much later. So I'll come back to that in a second. Mm-hmm. Can you just remind people how and I think this is useful, in 1916, it wasn't even evident then that there was going to be
I think I've lost you. Can you hear me?
He is lost, Dan. If you've got any comments on what he was saying.
Okay, yeah, sure. So yes, so what happened was in the 1890s, you had three cultural movements that changed the definition of Irish identity. You had a sporting organization called the Gaelic Athletic Association, which tried to develop native Irish games and turn Irish people away from those games that were growing in popularity in Britain: cricket, rugby, and soccer. You also had the Gaelic League, which was dedicated to the revival of the Irish language as the spoken language of Ireland. And then you had the literary revival, which was Yeats and some of his contemporaries who tried to create a national literature for Ireland in the English language. So turn the clock forward to 1914. At that stage, the Home Rule Party managed to achieve its great ambition, which it had cherished for nearly 40 years. It actually got a Home Rule bill passed through the British Parliament and approved by the House of Lords. Now, at the same time, there was a rebellion in Northern Ireland, and unionists there who didn't want to be part of a Home Rule Ireland formed a militia called the Ulster Volunteer Force, and they threatened to violently resist any imposition of Home Rule on Ireland. So in 1914, Ireland was perhaps headed for some kind of civil war between two armed militias, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Ulster Volunteers in Northern Ireland, and the Irish Volunteers in the rest of Ireland. Then the war came, and the British government decided that the Home Rule Bill would be passed, would take effect, but it wouldn't be implemented until after the war. Now, remember, in 1914, most people thought the war would be over by Christmas, but it took more than 4 years before the war came to an end. And what happened when the war broke out was that the Irish volunteers, which were perhaps 150,000, 200,000 people, had joined this militia to defend Home Rule against those in Northern Ireland who might have wanted to block Home Rule by violent means. And that organization split. And most of those people decided that they would go and support the war effort. So about 200,000 Irish people signed up for service in the British military during the First World War, and maybe 40,000 lost their lives altogether. But a smaller group of perhaps 15, 20,000 refused and said, no, we're not going to fight on the battlefields of the Western Front in Gallipoli. We are going to bide our time and we're going to defend Ireland at home. So that group, that smaller group, was the group that organized the Easter Rising of 1916. And in fact, it wasn't even that group as such, because there was a group within that group who were called the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And they were a small secret society, and they were the ones who secretly organized this rebellion. And but those who fought in the rebellion were members of the Irish Volunteers. But because the Irish Volunteers were quite small initially, and even then they split as well, because their official leader, Owen McNeill, was totally against the rising, and he called off the manoeuvres that were meant to take place on Easter Sunday. Those manoeuvres took place on Easter Monday, and in the end, only about 1,500 people fought in the rising of 1916. And the rising only really happened in Dublin. There was supposed to be a rising around the country, but that never took place because the word came down from Dublin that the whole thing was called off, and therefore...
So essentially, it was a failure, but it was the action of the British Army afterwards that really causes this earthquake.
When I was a student in the early 70s, there was a biography of the leader of the Easter Rising, Patrick Pearse, who was a school headmaster and a poet and writer, an intellectual and a cultural nationalist. And that biography was called The Triumph of Failure. So this was an example of how you fail. I mean, the Rising lasted 6 days, 5-6 days, until the force, the overwhelming force that the British Army could bring to bear against the rebels finally forced their surrender. And large parts of central Dublin were reduced to rubble, and 15 of the leading figures within the Rising were executed in the weeks following the Rising. And the execution of the leaders seems to have been at least part of the reason why public opinion turned from being hostile to the Rising initially to being supportive of it and to wanting to build on the legacy of the Rising. And the War of Independence that followed from 1919 until 1921 was really a second lap for those who had fought in the Rising of 1916. But they learned a lesson in 1916, which was don't take over major buildings and leave yourself as a target for the overwhelming military force that the British government could bring to bear against the rebels. Use your knowledge of the countryside and engage in guerrilla warfare. And in fact, the Irish independence struggle was one of the early examples of guerrilla warfare, which turned out to be much more effective in challenging British rule in Ireland.
Okay, I'm not going to get bogged down in talking about the breakup of Ireland in terms of the Ulster, the 6 counties, and the border and how all that was established. But the idea that I'm interested in is that it seems to me that the Ireland that evolves from 1922-21 is so different from what the Irish Republican Brotherhood would have envisaged, different from what Yeats and Joyce would have envisaged, something deeply conservative and essentially a Catholic nation. And really, in so much of its society, think of education, healthcare, social services, really run by the church. And this is with De Valera there. Yeah. How did that come about, and why does that last for so long?
Well, I mean, Catholicism was always part of Irish identity, and perhaps the the Gaelic and the literary dimensions that were profiled in the 1890s and into the early part of the 20th century maybe gave the wrong impression about the nature of Irish nationalism. I remember reading a piece by, or a comment made by Kevin O'Higgins, who was one of the ministers who took office in the first government of the Free State from 1922. He was actually assassinated by the IRA in 1927, but he was quite a strong man in that first government. And he said, we were the most conservative revolutionaries ever to carry out a successful revolution. So the reality is that while there was a radical dimension to the freedom struggle, you did have a citizen army that took part in the rebellion, and one of the leaders of the rebellion, James Connolly, was a socialist, and the first documents that were issued by the Irish Parliament when it was elected in 1918, 1919 was quite radical. In fact, for the most part, the people involved did not want to create an entirely new society, and they were quite happy to have a conservative Catholic state as an expression of Irish identity. So I think it was maybe ought to have been predictable, but I mean, Yeats, for example, was furious at what happened in Ireland in the 1920s, and he became a sharp critic of independent Ireland. He was a senator, of course, in the Irish Free State for 6 years, but he gave some pretty hard-hitting speeches hitting back against the dominance of Irish public life by a very, very, what he would have called a narrowly Catholic ethos. So I guess given the fact that 90% of the population of the new state were Catholic, given that a large percentage of the educated element in our society at that time were either clergymen or very partial to the church. I mean, when De Valera came into office in 1932, he was viewed by some as a reckless, revolutionary, anarchist, socialist kind of character. In fact, he was a deeply conservative man, and he very quickly made it plain that he was not going to be any kind of social revolutionary. So for the most part, the Irish Revolution was a political revolution. It didn't change the nature of Irish society. And one of the reasons for that is interesting, is that in the early part of the 20th century, the British government decided to bow to popular pressure in Ireland and bring in land reform. And they passed a series of land acts, which effectively transferred ownership of the land of Ireland from the landlords, who were largely Protestants and owned large estates that had been acquired in the 17th, 18th centuries, and it handed it back to the tenants, farmers, who became the owners of their land. And that, in a way, removed the radical urges that had been there. So in the 1880s, you had a land war, which was quite radical in many ways, but it petered out when the British government made this decision to actually make it possible for Irish farmers to buy their own land. And so from then on, those farmers were rather on the conservative side of things, not wanting to bring about any kind of dramatic social change.
This is I'm not informed by anything academic, but my gut feeling is that the Irish identity has been shaped in the middle of the 20th century in opposition to Britain because of that history, but also shaped by the conflict that begins to rage in Northern Ireland in the early 70s. Is that a fair comment to make? How did you see, and particularly the conflict in the north, shaping people's art view among themselves within the Republic?
Well, I mean, yes, definitely. Irish identity has evolved greatly over the last 50 years, and I put it down to 3 or 4 factors. Firstly, we had an educational revolution in the late 1960s, and I was one of the beneficiaries of that. I was the first member of my family ever to finish high school and the first member of my family ever to go to university. And that would have been very common at that time, because suddenly in the late 60s, the government started investing more heavily in education and opening up education to broader participation. Now we have one of the highest levels of third level education in many countries.
And more secular as well.
Of course, I mean, but, that sort of, those things go together in a way, because if you start to educate people to higher levels, they're not likely to be willing indefinitely to sort of take instruction from bishops or cardinals. So that's the first factor. Second factor, I think, is the perception that we have of being part of a global community. So, Ireland, maybe more than most other countries of our size, has a kind of a global reach through the Irish diaspora and people coming back. And also, of course, possession of the English language makes it far easier for Irish people to be exposed to currents in the international arena. I grew up in an Ireland where, the Beatles were more important to us than any Irish patriot, although there was still great reverence for those who had fought and died for Ireland. But, popular culture was a more powerful influence on me and my generation than patriotic culture as such. And then the third factor would be, I think, membership of the European Union, which again kind of opened Ireland out to wider influences, and also gave us the wherewithal because our economy started to improve. And then, of course, finally, the scandals that have plagued the Irish Catholic Church over the last 30 years certainly had a major effect in undermining public confidence in the Catholic Church, kind of a guide for our society.
But if I can go back a step, I think you're talking about the recent evolution, and we've had the Berlin correspondent for the Irish Times, Derek Scully. Yeah, he was written a wonderful book. I mean, he went to Berlin, he left an Ireland behind, and he came back 5 or 6 years later to spend a bit more time, and he found his country had entirely changed. People essentially had turned against the Catholic Church. So that's, I think, a very recent evolution. Those things have really come to the fore. But I want to go back to the 70s, and I was born in 1969. My childhood, I can remember the conflict. I can remember the bombs. Even my stepfather was and my mother were in the Brighton bomb, and we had at some stage he was on a hit list of the IRA. And I then spent time in the early 90s. I worked at Radio Foyle in Derry briefly. So I had a direct experience of it. My guess is that many Irish people looking at Northern Ireland would have seen the horror of Bloody Sunday, internment, the hunger strikes. That would have kept antipathy towards Britain for a long period of time. But then, with the Good Friday Agreement, 1998, that subsides, and there's that in itself brings about, it's self-evident, isn't it? There's less tension on the island of Ireland, and there's more at ease. You don't have to be in conflict so much with the UK.
Look, here's how I see those things. The Ireland I grew up in was definitely a nationalist Ireland, right? I mean, my father and mother were both, I would say, gentle nationalists. They weren't, and the Ireland I grew up in wasn't fundamentalist. It was a kind of a gentle, rather poorly informed, maybe, nationalism, but it was a kind of a sentimental, but a gentle sentimentality, which is nothing wrong with that. And I think my parents' generation did a lot of good things, but they did have this kind of ethos of nationalism, but it was gentle, and they weren't like they didn't support anything by the way of violence. They were Irish Republicans, but of a strictly and thoroughly democratic character. But then, of course, in 1969, you had the start of the conflict in Northern Ireland. I would safely say that at that time, most people south of the border knew very little about Northern Ireland. I mean, the government had campaigns to end partition and reunite Ireland, but it was largely going through the motions for political reasons. It wasn't a serious effort to bring an end to partition. But the trouble is to force people of my generation to sit up and take an interest in Northern Ireland and to try to understand it. And that process of understanding has really gone on for the last 50 years. And I wouldn't say it's completed yet by any means. I still think people in the South, a lot of them have difficulty in understanding, what drives the kind of conflict and the divisions in Northern Ireland, because those divisions just don't apply in the South. I mean, growing up, I wouldn't have even known, even in the Foreign Service, I would honestly not have known the religion of any of my colleagues, at that time. Whereas in Northern Ireland, of course, people live in separate areas and so forth. So people have come to understand more about the complexity of the problems of Northern Ireland. And they've, and in fact, historians as well have been debating this as well, because from about the late 60s onwards, we've had revisionist historians who basically argued that, maybe this Easter Rising and this independence movement wasn't really necessary after all. Maybe we should have allowed Ireland to gradually become independent through Home Rule, and then Home Rule ultimately developing into some form of independence, but without the violence that scarred Ireland in the 1920s, and again, of course, from the 60s until the 90s. So revisionist historians have certainly had an impact. I mean, I myself I'm a very moderate nationalist. In other words, when I say that, what I mean is that ultimately I probably would say that, there's a logic to the island of Ireland having a single administration, because it's a relatively small island, and and the divisions that are there don't seem to be terribly warranted. But I'm not someone who's pushing on the accelerator and insisting there must be a referendum now. That's not my.
But I mean, there's something I don't want to get ahead, but we will talk about Sinn Féin possibly coming into government in 2025, which raises some big questions there. But before that, I want to deal with Brexit, because you had the Good Friday Agreement, you had that peace settlement, which is good, obviously, very obviously within Northern Ireland, but also between Ireland and Britain. But then Brexit comes about, and you were the Irish ambassador in the UK at the time, and you were outspoken about this, and you made it very clear that the constitutional challenges, not just within Britain, but the cause for Northern Ireland, the problems that would cause for Northern Ireland would be colossal. But this was obviously dismissed at the time. Why weren't you taken seriously?
Well, I mean, I think Ireland has always been comfortable in its skin as a member of the European Union. I don't think Britain ever was. I think for Britain, the burden of the past, the greatness of Great Britain and the imperial history of Britain made it very difficult for the country to be a satisfied member of the European Union. So when the Brexit issue emerged and the referendum took place, I think it was very difficult for the Remain side to mount an effective campaign, because they just didn't have the emotional vocabulary to be able to argue the case for European Union, whereas their opponents on the Brexit side had the emotional armory of British history and British greatness and so forth. And why are we stuck in this, second class European?
But I guess the point is that you had a huge amount of stake in this. The island of Ireland was going to suffer. The Good Friday Agreement was going to be torn up. It's essentially a very large part of it.
It's not quite as, I wouldn't go and be as dramatic as that, but I mean, yes, I mean, I think I was the only foreign ambassador in Britain at that time who said anything about the referendum. Everyone else just, stayed mum. But I was out every day. I'd say I tweeted every day about, I never said vote Remain, but I pointed out the challenges that would arise for British-Irish relations, for Northern Ireland, for North-South relations in Ireland, and for the border between North and Southern Ireland, that these would become significant problems that had been to a large extent resolved as a result of EU membership. But I mean, there was a passion behind Brexit that had, nothing to do with Ireland, and that wasn't willing to listen to anything in the way of argumentation that would, slow or stop the Brexit train. The Brexit train just built up velocity, and I think couldn't be stopped ultimately. And that was unfortunate, because I think looking back now, you can see that Brexit was not a great move on the part of the British people, and to a large extent, people were taken in by arguments that everything would be the same, nothing would change. We can have our cake and eat it too. We had the best of both worlds. All those things were always fantasies, but they were powerfully argued fantasies, and the Remain side simply had no answer to them.
Yeah. I'd love to get more questions. I know we've got a question in a second from Richard Murphy that goes back a bit to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation. But please do, everyone, put your question in the Q&A box, and so we can put things directly to Daniel. I think that possibly you have a self-confident Ireland within the European Union. You'd had a peace framework within Northern Ireland. And it seems to me that the challenges now are much greater. Ireland's allies, Europe's facing difficult problems. If you have a Sinn Féin government, it's beginning to become even more complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, well, first of all, unlike Britain and the United States and Australia, Ireland has a different electoral system. So we're not a winner-takes-all country. So being the biggest party is interesting, but it's not decisive or definitive. So while I think it's very likely that Sinn Féin will be the largest party in the next parliament, it will not be able to form a government on its own. We'll need to find coalition allies. That process could take months, and it's no guarantee that the government that emerges from those talks will actually contain Sinn Féin. But if it were to contain Sinn Féin, let's just say, okay, Sinn Féin finds an ally, finds a coalition partner, and ends up in government, presumably as the biggest party in government, then it would face quite a few challenges because it would, I suppose, its own supporters, particularly those in Northern Ireland, by the way, would probably start to push hard for Sinn Féin to demand an early referendum on Irish unity. And that would create, obviously, problems between Britain and Ireland, because the British government would presumably resist. And then you would have a standoff between the biggest party in government in Ireland and the British government over the holding of a referendum on Irish unity. Also, I think Sinn Féin is making, fairly ambitious promises about what they would do to improve our health service, which is a problem everywhere, as you know. No health service in the world these days is in great shape because of the rising cost and demand and so forth, people living longer. Same is true in Ireland. And also, the issue of housing, because Irish people have an even more powerful desire than people elsewhere in the world to own their own homes for historical reasons. And there's a shortage of supply of housing, and the affordability issue is there as well. And Sinn Féin have kind of made fairly ambitious promises that they will rectify this problem. And it may not be that easy to do so, because building houses is something that takes time and resources, and it's not as straightforward as it might seem. Otherwise, the existing government would have, resolved the problem long ago. And then, of course, there's the issue of immigration, which is really starting to make its mark now, for the first time ever, by the way, on the Irish public square. We now have about 20% of our population was born outside of Ireland, born outside the state. Now, most of those are European Union citizens who've come into Ireland looking for jobs and opportunity, which is a very good thing. But we also have an increasing number of people from other parts of the world, and an increasing number of asylum seekers who may be small in number but are very visible, and there's a lot of resentment about that that's growing in the public domain. And we've had a few nasty incidents recently of arson attacks on buildings that were being geared up to receive immigrants, receive asylum seekers. And we've also had to accommodate 100,000 Ukrainians over the last 2 years, which is a huge number. And in British terms, that would be, the equivalent would be 1.2 or 3 million. So it's a lot of people to have to accommodate for a country of our size. And that could become even worse if things go the wrong way in Ukraine. So all these problems are going to be very challenging for Sinn Féin. And the key thing about them is that they have no experience of government. They've never been in government. So my hope would be that if they do end up in government, next year. Sorry, somebody's going to have it.
The business is broken. There are holes in it. We need to just stop.
Sorry.
Sorry. I think you'll need to open your microphone again, Daniel. For some reason, it's just gone off there, your microphone.
I apologize for that. I had to go away and turn off my my TV, which came on for some strange reason. Anyway, so what was your last question again?
I think also some of the other issues in terms of we're talking about Sinn Féin, but also the other key thing is that Ireland has been non-aligned outside NATO. These relationships being tested. So both domestically, there are things happening that challenge a consensus. Immigration, migrants. I think touching upon that issue, I think within Sinn Féin there's an element of Euroscepticism too. The European Union has there's pressure on Ireland, particularly after the war in Ukraine, to do something about defence. Who's it relying on for its defence? Is it sort of freeloading on perhaps on Britain or the rest of the EU? I don't know. So those are many.
I mean, EU membership in Ireland has a positive rating of about 80%. So about 80% of the population are, broadly speaking, will indicate that they're in favour of EU membership. So it's one of the highest figures, probably is the highest figure anywhere in Europe. And that's for very good reason. Ireland has benefited hugely from EU membership. The country's been transformed economically and socially and in many other ways. So, and the one Achilles heel really for Ireland in the European Union is that the public has always been reticent on the defence front. And every time we have a referendum on a European treaty, which we have to have whenever there's a new treaty, we have to ratify, because the Constitution requires a referendum to change the Constitution and therefore to ratify any new European treaty. Defence issue always raises its head, even if there's no issue to be dealt with, even if there's nothing in the treaties about defence, there'll always be this kind of argument that somehow this treaty is designed to undermine Irish neutrality. So if you look at the current outlook in Europe, especially if Donald Trump were to become president again in January of next year, that would clearly put question marks about the future US commitment to NATO and to pushing back against Russia in Ukraine, and therefore there would, I think, be some move to strengthen Europe's defence preparedness, and I think that would pose a major challenge for Ireland. I still hope that we could find a way of being part of a new European defence community in ways that would be palatable, be acceptable to the Irish electorate. I think within a European defence community, there ought to be different rooms for countries with different skill sets. Yes. Our skill set is very definitely in the field of peacekeeping and so forth. And maybe Ireland can become a kind of a peacekeeping unit for the European Union for the future. But this is a major challenge, no doubt about that. It's a major challenge for the whole of Europe, of course, because Europe is a bit divided on that. There are a number of European governments that are more sympathetic, shall we say, to Vladimir Putin than others would be.
Okay. We've got about another 20 minutes to go, and I've got a really big question coming up here from Sheila de Belague. So let you go ahead with your question, Sheila.
Yes, hello. It's almost interesting. I was just wondering, I mean, if United Ireland were to come about, obviously there might be tensions with the Protestant population in Northern Ireland. But would it all be sweetness and light between the Catholic populations in the north and the south, given that they've lived such different lives and evolved so differently?
Yep, no, that's a very valid point. I mean, here's what I would say about that in response to your question, which is a very good question indeed, and one that we'll have to grapple with. In Northern Ireland, about 40% of the population these days would be Catholic. About 40% would be Protestant, and about 20% would declare themselves to be neither. That they don't have so the 40% that are Catholic would identify as nationalists, the 40% who are Protestant would identify as unionists, and the other 20% would identify as others. Okay? So to get a united Ireland, you have to convince all the Catholics and at least half of the group in between. And to have a successful united Ireland, you probably are going to need a 60%. Now, that's not required under the law. It's not required under the Good Friday Agreement. But I think for practical purposes, you would certainly want to have a vote, a support of 60% of the population of Northern Ireland, because that would mean that the number opposed to it would be smaller and therefore less maybe inclined or likely to cause difficulties following the decision to create a united Ireland. So that's a big challenge. And even after a united Ireland, if you have 40%, say, optimistically, who voted against it, probably most of those would say, well, I accept the democratic decision. But there would be a certain percentage who would say, I don't accept it, and I'm going to engage in civil disobedience. And there might even be a 5% who, or 10% who would say, I am going to resist this united Ireland by force of arms. So that's a serious challenge. Now, when you talk about the Catholic population in Northern Ireland and the Catholic population in the South, it is clearly the case that they are different. They've lived separately for the last 100 years. What I would say is that over the last maybe 30 years, we have seen greater engagement and contact between the two parts of Ireland. And that would include, I think, greater contact between the communities, including the Catholic community in Northern Ireland and the Catholic community in the South. But undoubtedly, you know, I would say that if you had a referendum tomorrow on Irish unity, it would certainly pass in the South, but it wouldn't be 90-10. It wouldn't even be 80-20. I think you're talking about something in the region of 60-40, because a lot of people in that 40% would say, well, I'd like it, but it's too much trouble, and I don't want to have to pay the cost for the next 20 years of subsidizing Northern Ireland. So it's not a case that everyone in the South is 100% committed to or in favour of a united Ireland. There are many people in the South who have doubts. I mean, I did a straw poll among my family members there about a year ago, and, you know, there was nobody who was gung-ho. They all said, yeah, I would accept it. I think it's a good thing. But they weren't exactly bursting at the seams to embrace a united Ireland. They were, a lot of them were quite conditional in their response. Some of them were even opposed for economic reasons. We can't afford it. Why would we take on a project like this, which would cost us a huge amount of our national wealth to pull off, and we mightn't even succeed at that level.
Sheila, I was struck by a comment that I'm trying to remember who made it now. I can't remember. It was a Fianna Gael member of the Senate. And he said that if there was to be a new Ireland or United Ireland, Ireland would have to be necessarily more British, which was quite a remarkable point. But basically,
probably Senator Frank Feehan, I would say. I think that sounds like Senator Frank Feehan. I mean, yeah. I'd be willing to discuss all of these things, right? But some people in the South are saying, no, we don't have any discussion of the flag, no discussion of the anthem, no discussion of joining the Commonwealth, no discussion of joining NATO. These are all things that I think would have to be in the mix. But the reason why people are opposed to those things now is because this thing is a very distant prospect. I think even when it comes closer, it'll have to be examined. And the Irish government, I think, will have an obligation to actually set out exactly what a united Ireland would look like, and then put that proposition to the people of Ireland, North and South.
And we were discussing this earlier, Daniel, and in marked contrast to the vote on the European Union and on Brexit in 2016, in which there was no real exploration of the constitutional economic complexities of what leaving the EU might mean for the UK. that if that question was put, and it's in the realm of the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland, based in London, to decide, necessarily people are going to start looking at those questions very seriously, and then you will get a debate about what kind of constitutional settlement there would be. Do you have a federal state? What are the measures? NHS, a whole range of things are going to have to be looked at.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is the work of at least a decade, which is why I'm not really in favor of a referendum for at least 10 years to sort of try and tease these things out. I hope in Ireland we have a long track record of holding referendums. We have to hold them anytime we want to change the constitution. Whereas in Britain, you only had, I think three.
Three, yeah.
One
on proportional representation, one on Brexit, and the 1975 vote on when we did join.
So there's no track record in Britain of having a referendum. Whereas in Ireland, what we do is we set up a referendum commission chaired by a High Court judge who produce material that makes the arguments for and against the changes proposed, and then material is sent out to every household in the country, and the members of the commission go on radio and television, and they kind of act as adjudicators between the opposing arguments. So I would hope that in Britain, if there is to be a referendum on Irish unity, that the British government would also engage in some kind of exercise designed to try to alert the people of Northern Ireland as to the the pros and cons of the different options that will be available to them.
Marty Ryan has got a good follow-up to Sheila de Beleg's question. Go ahead, Marty.
I'm curious as to how you could describe the differences in the culture between Northern Ireland and the Republic, as you've mentioned that they've lived apart for 100 years. So how would you describe the cultural differences?
Well, I mean, one of the problems is that, of course, Northern Ireland has two cultures. It has the unionist culture, which is British-oriented, and it has the nationalist culture, which is Irish-oriented. So, for example, Northern Irish unionists tend to, say in sport, they tend to play soccer and rugby. And Northern Ireland nationalists tend to play Gaelic games, Gaelic football and hurling. Now, there are, of course, people who cross the divide to play sport in the other communities' favourite sport. But, for example, when Northern Ireland play a soccer match, most of their supporters, almost maybe all their supporters traditionally, would be people from the Protestant community. Likewise, when it comes to something like music, Irish nationalists from Northern Ireland will tend to go and listen to traditional Irish music. Protestants much less likely to do that, although there are many exceptions to that rule. And even, in the area of language, Northern Irish nationalists, many of them try to learn the Irish language, learn the Gaelic language, and in fact they've been demanding recently to have road signs in both languages, and in many places those bilingual road signs have been attacked, presumably by Northern Protestants who don't like the idea of the Irish language getting any kind of profile in Northern Ireland. I mean, it's between North and South, there are differences, but they're more difficult to kind of put a finger on. But the fact is that, especially now with Brexit, a lot more people from the South go to European universities as part of the Erasmus program, which is funded by the European Commission. That would have been available to people from Northern Ireland, and it's now, in many cases, not available. So I think you will see a greater orientation of the south of Ireland towards Europe and so forth, and less of that happening in Northern Ireland. One thing I was really happy about was recently, last week, when the Irish Taoiseach was in Washington for the St. Patrick's Day celebrations, the First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland both went, and they seem to be enjoying themselves, and they seem to have been able to set aside their very fundamental political differences in order to promote Northern Ireland. And they seem to have a more outward-looking approach, which I think can only be a good thing for the future of Northern Ireland and the future of relations between North and South in Ireland. But
I think the other key point would be an economic one, Dan, in that it used to be that the North was an industrial hub. You can think of, in Belfast, the docks, shipbuilding and other industries too. And as those declined, like many other parts of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland's become poorer. And it's the inverse situation for the Republic, which membership of the European Union, banking, the bringing in lots of American companies with tax incentives. You've seen a massive economic boom in the Republic that you haven't seen in Northern Ireland, and it is noticeably different if you could travel between the two. Belfast looks pretty empty. It looks a poorer city. You go to Dublin, and it is packed, very expensive, one of the most expensive places for housing and accommodation in Europe, actually. Now, so the contrast now is an economic one is fairly stark.
Yeah, no, that is true. I mean, Ireland has benefited greatly from its membership of the European Union. There are now 750 US multinationals with investments in Ireland. They employ about 200,000 people, about 7% of the total workforce employed by American companies. And then, of course, the spin-off from those companies is huge as well. And a lot of Irish companies have emerged to service the needs of the multinationals from their base in Ireland.
Yeah. Now I want to take. I've ignored Richard Murphy for a reason, because I do want to go back to the beginning of our conversation, and in a second talk about Joyce and Yeats again. But a very good question from Richard Murphy that goes back to that period. Then go ahead, Richard.
I was just you talked about the things how it changed the conservative situation, but I want to pick up on the point about women. There very much seems to be a feeling that they're coming on, and women were very involved in the revolution, those changes, and then that was sort of written out of history and is now emerging. And I suppose it just gives to that broader question then of the role of women and minorities and sexuality, and obviously even it's come up in the referendums we've just had. Role that was written into that. And just to say, I'm from Enniscorthy. So
very good. Well, not very far from me. I'm from Waterford. I passed through Enniscorthy hundreds of times on my way from Dublin to Waterford. So, but not anymore. Now,
revolutionary history there. So,
there was a fair bit of that in 1798 and all of that. Yeah. No, look, I mean, a good point that I'd say 100 years ago, Ireland would have been a fairly progressive, advanced country from the point of view of the role of women in public life. It didn't start with Cumann na mBan. Even if you go back to the Land League of the 1880s, which was campaigning for land reform, there was a ladies' land league at that time. Indeed, in America, the Ancient Order of Hibernians was founded in the 1840s. By the 1880s, there was a ladies' Ancient Order of Hibernians as well. So there was a tradition of women being involved in public life as auxiliaries to the role of their menfolk in fighting whatever political cause they were committed to. In that generation that it came into its own around the time of the Easter Rising. So people born in the 1870s and 80s who, and they appear to have been certainly a very progressive generation, almost reminding me of the 1960s and the kind of a liberal ethos that spread at that time. So, you had actually in the early part of the 20th century, Maud Gonne, who was W.B. Yeats's great love interest, for whom he had a kind of a lifelong infatuation. She formed a group called the Daughters of Erin back in the early years, or back around 1900. In fact, she formed the organization to protest vehemently against the visit to Ireland by Queen Victoria, who came over to Ireland in 1900, and Maud Gonne dubbed her the Famine Queen because she blamed her for the famine of the 1840s. So there was a long tradition, if you like, of women's auxiliary organisations, and Cumann na mBan was certainly part and parcel of that. And there were women who fought in the Easter Rising, and not just as nurses and messengers, but actually who fought. Constance Markievicz would be the best known example of that. She was an aristocrat from the west of Ireland, and she is supposed to have fired some of the first shots and actually killed a policeman on Stephen's Green. And then there was a woman called Margaret Skinner, who was from Glasgow but came over to Ireland fighting the Easter Rising, and she was a sniper. So women were very fully involved. And then, of course, if you look at the election of 1918, the first woman ever to be elected to the British Parliament was Constance Markievicz. She never took her seat, but she has the distinction of being the first woman ever elected to the British Parliament. She became a member of the Provisional Irish Government that was established in 1918 and 1919. So, women played an important role. And then after independence, I'm afraid, the tables were turned on women. And by the 30s, De Valera was putting language into the Constitution that some of the women who were involved in Cumann na mBan were vehemently disappointed by and complained to De Valera, but were ignored by him. There was a woman called Dorothy McCardle, who was from a wealthy brewing family in Dundalk and was a teacher in one of the big private schools in Dublin. She wrote very strong letters to De Valera complaining about the way in which women were being relegated and pushed out of the public space by the wording of the Constitution, which, of course, the government recently tried to change and weren't able to get it through a referendum.
Danny, it's possibly a trite question or point to make, but if we think of how Catholicism and conservatism has fallen rapidly by the wayside, the criticism of the Catholic Church and how that's been pushed back in the last sort of 10 years, 15 years or so. And also the dominance of W.B. Yeats and Joyce in terms of their literary hold over Ireland and Irish culture. They'd both be pretty happy with what they see now, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, Yeats would have wanted a hybrid culture. In other words, with the Gaelic elements as an important form of inspiration, source of inspiration, but the English language as the language which carries this inspiration to the wider world through poetry, drama, and prose. So I think W.B. Yeats would be happy with today's Ireland, which is very multicultural. The English and Irish, the Gaelic and English elements in our history and in our culture are, I think, mingled in a very positive way, which Yeats would have certainly aspired to. And he'd be happy with the more liberal nature of today's Ireland as well, because he was an advocate for a liberal Ireland. He argued for divorce in the 1920s, when, of course, there was no chance of the Irish government at that time passing a measure to allow for divorce. But that came after a referendum some 20 plus years ago. So I think Yeats would be very pleased to see the way in which Ireland has evolved in recent times. James Joyce, likewise, I think, for different reasons, because he didn't really care for Yeats's focus on the Irish peasantry and folklore and Gaelic mythology. He was far more interested. He once wrote in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he said, Michael Robartes, which was his name for Yeats, he's always thinking about the beauty that has faded from the world. Me, I want to embrace in my arms the beauty that has not yet come into the world. So in other words, he felt he had a modernist goal to create a new literature for a new era. But he would be pleased as well, because he was a European at heart, and he would, I think, be very gratified to see Ireland embracing its identity as a European nation without losing that distinctive Irish quality that Joyce also immortalized in his books.
Dan, thank you so much. We set ourselves an ambitious target, which was to talk about the evolution of Irish culture.
Well, another 3 hours. I mean, I can give a Gladstonian
1 hour.
speech in 2 hours.
We did it. It's been really, really good. I've really enjoyed it, and we've had some good questions too.
Hope everyone's enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, fantastic. So thank you very much indeed. It's been a wonderful session.